Welcome to the Point, Line, Superficies, and Solid in Symbolism and Philosophy, a video lecture with me, C.R. Chuck Dunning, Jr. An alternate title for this presentation has been Geometric Intersections with Kabbalah and Platonism in the Craft Lodge and the Rose Croix. We could also just call it Fun with Symbols. As a preface, I want to say that I'm going to be sharing some insights I had many years ago, but never wrote more than a few cursory notes about. Recently, a brother and I were having a conversation that reminded me of those old insights. I said to him that I had never written or presented about them, but that perhaps I should. So now you're seeing the results of that conversation. So now we will examine some interesting connections that can be made between the Kabbalistic tree of life and Masonic and Rosicrucian symbols. Just in case this is unfamiliar to you, here's a quick and very superficial introduction to the Kabbalistic tree of life. It is a diagram that portrays 10 fundamental powers or principles of creation, represented in this image by 10 dots or spheres. Western esotericism borrows this diagram from the tradition of Jewish Kabbalah, which also appears to be based on and influenced by older traditions, including Platonism. In Hebrew, the 10 powers on the tree are collectively referred to as Sephirot, with the singular being Sephirah. And I'm not a native Hebrew speaker, and therefore my pronunciations are likely to be off. The present diagram shows common English translations of the Hebrew names of the Sephirot. The top Sephirah is called Keter in Hebrew, which means crown. It represents the divine will entering the process of creation. From it flow all the other Sephirot, descending from the quintessence of spirit into the densest matter, the latter of which is represented by the bottom Sephirah named Malkut, meaning dominion. In this process, each Sephirah represents a more particular aspect of the divine, an archetype that is associated with a planet, one or more spiritual beings, such as a particular archangel, a virtue, and many other things. And here is a version of the Tree of Life that is presented to initiates of the 4th degree in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of the Southern jurisdiction, highlighting the virtues of the Sephirot presented in that rite. Note that in the lecture of that degree, it is said that it is impossible to fully comprehend the symbolism of the rite without sufficient familiarity with Kabbalah. Although the arrangements may vary, the Sephirot are traditionally connected by 22 lines called paths, which correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew language. By the way, the diagram on the right already shows one symbolic connection between craft masonry and Kabbalah. Notice that the 3 columns on the Tree of Life correspond to the 3 principal supports of the Masonic Lodge: wisdom, strength, and beauty. The column of strength is also called Boaz, literally meaning strength, and the column of wisdom is also called Yakin, or Jachin, or Jachin, depending on jurisdiction, which means establishment. And since we're allowing ourselves a bit of fun with our symbolism, how about this additional connection of the Tree of Life with the crowned double-headed eagle of the 33rd degree? The paths of the tree shown on the left reveal important connections and interactions between the Sephirot, and their geometry has a great deal of symbolic depth, some of which we will get into in a moment. But first, notice on the diagram to the left that there is a marked yet unlabeled place on the tree between the upper triad of Sephirot 1, 2, and 3 and the middle triad of 4, 5, and 6. This location is traditionally named dot in Hebrew, which is translated into English as knowledge. This knowledge is not ordinary, like what we gain through the physical senses and reasoning. It is mystical knowledge, a direct experiential awakening to or revelation of the divine. The term Noesis is often associated with it. It is sometimes shown as if it is an 11th Sephirah, which can be confusing, but as we will soon see, its place on the tree is noteworthy. Now, recalling a previous statement about the geometric significances of the tree, let us turn our attention to the Blue Lodge, or craft Freemasonry. One of its most common lessons in geometry is stated as follows. Geometry treats of the powers and properties of magnitudes in general, where length, breadth, and thickness are considered, from a point to a line, from a line to a superficies, and from a superficies to a solid. A point is a dimensionless figure, or an indivisible part of space. A line is a point continued, and a figure of one capacity, namely length. A superficies is a figure of two dimensions, namely length and breadth. A solid is a figure of three dimensions, namely length, breadth, and thickness. Considering that all Masonic symbolism is meant to communicate profound truths of morality, we may wonder why our ritual offers no interpretation of these facts about geometry, let alone a moral one. Unlike many other symbols, no allegorical meaning is given that we might apply in our efforts to become better workers in the builder's art. It seems to me that this vacancy is typically passed over without any recognition at all. Ponder this fact a moment. Here we have a fundamental illustration of the nature of geometry, the art and science which many of our rituals identify as synonymous with Masonry, yet no association is offered with any moral or social virtue. Why is that? While not a complete answer to this question, it seems clear that this statement is entirely left to our own speculation and contemplation. Indeed, in William Preston's illustrations of Masonry, which so powerfully shaped the craft, the word contemplation appears more frequently in reference to geometry than elsewhere. Consider these excerpts. Here we find employment for leisure hours, trace science from its original source, and, drawing the attention to the sum of perfection, contemplate with admiration on the wonderful works of the Creator. Geometry is displayed with all its powers and properties, and in the disquisition of this science, the mind is filled with pleasure and delight. Such is the latitude of this section that the most judicious may fail in an attempt to explain it, as the rational powers are exerted to their utmost stretch. The contemplation of this science in a moral and comprehensive view fills the mind with rapture. To the true geometrician, the regions of matter with which he is surrounded afford ample scope for his admiration, while they open a sublime field for his inquiry and disquisition. Every particle of matter on which he treads, every blade of grass which covers the field, every flower which blows, and every insect which wings its way in the bounds of expanded space, proves the existence of a first cause and yields pleasure to the intelligent mind. Note that the added underlining highlights that the contemplation of geometry is intended to lead the mind beyond the ordinary mundane dimensions of morality and into a comprehensive view. In that view, morality is not only about our relationship with other humans, but with nature and with the divine. These quotes suggest that it requires the utmost stretch of our mental faculties, opens a sublime field for investigation and reveals a first cause for all things in creation. In this presentation, I hope we will see how all these developments can happen and why the symbolism of the point, line, superficies, and solid are so important to the deeper or higher possibilities of the builder's art. Here is where we can make good use of the Kabbalistic tree of life in Masonry, noting how these geometric elements and their progression can be found there. So first we have the point, and to it we add the line. To the line, we add the superficies. And to the superficies, the solid. And so we have a parallel between the Kabbalistic tree of life and the point, line, superficies, and solid. Isn't it interesting that exactly 10 points are required to illustrate this progression? In the diagram on the right, the lowest figure composed of 4 dots and 6 lines is a two-dimensional representation of the simplest three-dimensional solid, which is a tetrahedron. So, how is the meaning evoked by Preston to be found in this imagery? One way to begin answering that question is to recall that the verticality of the tree represents, from top to bottom, spirit descending into ever denser and more complex forms of creation. In this context, we also consider that, since evidence strongly suggests that the Kabbalistic tree of life was influenced by Platonic thought, then Plato's allegory of the divided line may also be helpful. Before we get into that parallel, we should review Plato's view of the nature of reality, which was dominant among Western philosophers for thousands of years until Aristotelian thinking became preferred by Catholic institutions across Europe. In the Platonic view, everything in the physical world is temporary and subject to decay and destruction. But all these physical things are reflections of and owe their existence to archetypes, literally principal forms in Greek, which are metaphysical or spiritual in nature. The archetypes are divine and are not subject to decay and destruction, and thus they are more real than physical things. We find a similar view in the Abrahamic faiths, where it is taught that humans are created in the image of God, which is to say, the form of God. It is also present in the idea that the human body can die, but the soul is immortal. In effect, the material depends upon the spiritual for its existence, and thus the spiritual is more real. So, for Plato and his followers, the greater truths of our being are not to be found in the material world of things, but in the metaphysical and spiritual realities upon which the things are based. A true philosopher must therefore learn how to elevate one's consciousness, and the allegory of the divided line is a guide, or a ladder, if you will, for that ascent. On the left side of this image, you see the division of the visible realm as the bottom two segments and the intelligible realm as the top two. The visible realm is that of the 5 senses, our perceptions of what we receive through them, and the opinions we hold about those perceptions. The visible realm corresponds to the solid because our senses connect us with the manifest world of 3 dimensions. Plato spoke of this realm in terms of opinions, partly because our senses cannot be trusted at face value. There is too much evidence that our senses only provide us with partial and often inaccurate information. He further divided that realm into two segments. The lowest is acacia, which means imagination in modern Greek, but which he used to refer to illusion, false understandings, or conjectures imagined to be true. The segment above it he called pistis, which today is commonly translated as faith, but by which he meant belief or assumptions about the truth of things that are based largely on common sense or the norms of thinking and behavior inculcated and expected within a given social environment. Plato argued that we do not begin to break free of the limitations and falsehoods of acacia and pistis until we start exercising the faculty of dianoia, or discursive reasoning, and thus enter into the intelligible realm. The geometric analogy here is that we really do not begin to more fully understand a solid figure until we engage in rational analysis of its shape, mentally breaking it down into various two-dimensional parts and discerning the mathematical qualities of those parts and their relationships with each other. If you have ever taken a course in geometry, you might recall all the time spent in doing proofs of various theorems, like the 47th problem of Euclid, also known as the Pythagorean theorem. A similar process of reasoning can be applied to anything in this world, including our own social, political, and cultural experiences. In such a process, we begin to discern the various elements that make up not only our collective being, but also our individual being. The parts, contents, and operations of our psyches, and how they are affected by each other and things external to us. Applying this sort of reasoning to ourselves is a contemplative practice that Freemasonry repeatedly urges us to do in order to make ourselves more perfect ashlars, more fitting stones for the house not made with hands, and more effective instruments of light in this world. So, in moving from acacia and pistis to dianoia, we have moved from the solid to the superficies. But the progression through this analogy is obviously not yet done. We note that a superficies is defined by at least 3 lines in 2 dimensions, and that a line is a one-dimensional connection between 2 points. A line is a continuum that represents the relationship between those 2 different locations in space. Yet, by definition, a point is dimensionless, and thus there are an infinite number of them in any line, and therefore a specific quantification of length is only a convenience based upon some standard, a convention, an agreement, a kind of common sense. And we have already seen the connection between common sense and distortion of our perceptions and understanding of reality and truth. The infinitude of points in any line poses serious problems for our common notion that anything can be known in exact mathematically quantifiable detail. It leads to a set of paradoxes about the very nature of number, the relationship of numbers and geometry, and their relationship with sensory experience in the manifest world. For example, in geometry, we cannot avoid working with what are called irrational numbers. An irrational number is one that cannot be described as a ratio of 2 integers. Said another way, an irrational number is one which, when expressed in decimals, is a never-ending string of non-repeating digits, something beyond reason's ability to contain. The most well-known example of this is pi, which is a number necessary for describing the circumference and area of a circle, sphere, or cylinder. Another, and probably the first to have been discovered, is found through the Pythagorean theorem. Here is a right triangle in which the two sides both measure 1 unit, producing a hypotenuse that equals the square root of 2 units, which is an irrational number. There are other irrational numbers like pi and the square root of 2 that we find necessary for understanding many things mathematically, and they are collectively referred to as irrational constants. Another example is the golden ratio, denoted by the Greek letter phi, which is so commonly referenced in the field of sacred geometry, and which is a very prominent factor in the five-pointed star that so often appears in Masonic symbolism. The dilemmas discovered through geometry can be disruptive to an ordinary conception of reality, in which most people take it for granted that there is precisely defined exactness in our measurements and thus our knowledge of things. But it turns out that the world is fuzzier than most people know or want to think about. And to some, it can even be a frightening assault on the certainty of their beliefs. That truth is illustrated by the legend that the Pythagorean philosopher Hippasus, having encountered and revealed the existence of irrational numbers, was killed, or at least exiled, for doing so. To go deeper, or higher, if you will, into these mysteries, consider that whatever size dot we draw on paper or on a screen or visualize in our minds cannot actually be a point. The fact that the dot is visible means it has dimensions, and the 3 dimensions of space continue down into tininess well beyond our ability to perceive. Even a dot that is 1/100 trillionth of a nanometer in height and width is still not a point. Since a line is a string of points, it too cannot actually be seen or even visualized. Every drawn or imagined point or line is only a representation, a symbol for a truth that is beyond not only our senses and imagination, but also beyond the ability of our reason to fully grasp. And yet we know the truth of points and lines, if for no other reason than they are indispensably useful in more competently and accurately understanding the shapes and movements of every object we know through the senses. The inescapable irrationality of geometry is one of the most direct encounters we have with the deep enigmas of our existence. It reveals that everything is filled with truth that transcends the limits of ordinary thought. In effect, reasoning itself has led us to a line in consciousness that reason cannot cross, but intuition can. And so we have symbolically ascended from a superficies to a line. It is no surprise then that we find Plato declaring that to know the greatest truth, we must first engage a faculty beyond reason, and that faculty he called Noesis, which is often translated as direct intuition. This kind of knowledge is not the simple feeling, hunch, guesswork, or other superficial reaction that we currently tend to associate with the word intuition. The typical meaning of intuition these days is due to Western science having spent so many centuries insisting that logical, empirical reasoning is the highest, most truthful mental activity for human beings. but the etymology of the word intuition reveals that it originally meant a spiritual or metaphysical perception directly into the nature of something. This problem with our word intuition did not exist when Plato used the term noesis, which means to know through consciousness alone and is closely related to the Greek words gnosis and gnostic, and shares meaning with the Hebrew word dot that we encountered on the tree of life. Through geometry, we begin perceiving metaphysical realities in recognizing that a three-dimensional solid is a collection of two-dimensional superficies arranged in a certain way. Yet we can only perceive a two-dimensional reality through the mind because every object perceived through the senses is three-dimensional. Reiterating the logic of this argument, each two-dimensional superficies is in turn a collection of one-dimensional lines, and each line is a one-dimensional set or collection of an infinite number of non-dimensional points. Interestingly, even when we generate a mental image of a line or a point, that image is two-dimensional at best. No matter how fine the line or small the dot, the fact that we can see it means that it has length and width. Lines and points are therefore not known through the senses or even by the visual imagination, but are deduced through reason and known through the wordless, imageless intuition of noesis. This Masonic lesson about geometry's basic elements can therefore be taken as an admonition to ponder that everything we observe with the physical senses or in ordinary visual imagination is a two- or three-dimensional manifestation or representation of one-dimensional and non-dimensional archetypal powers and principles. They are metaphysical, transcending our senses and even our reason. Through contemplation, geometry thus has the potential to lead our minds closer and closer to the source, the first cause, the great architect, which Plato called the form of the good. Through contemplatively accessing the intuitive faculty of noesis, we can know this ultimate truth not only as transcending creation, but also immanently and infinitely present within it here and now, just as every line, superficies, and solid is infinitely full of points. One implication is that the divine is always present everywhere. Masonically speaking, we are always in the temple of God, always communing with the light. But it is up to us to remember that fact and conduct ourselves accordingly. Having addressed this geometric imagery from the Craft Lodge, let us now turn to relevant symbolism in the Rose-Croix. The cube is an important symbol throughout the ancient and accepted rite. It has a number of allusions in alchemy and esoteric Christianity, and it also harkens back to the perfect ashlar and cornerstone in the Craft Lodge. In that Masonic context, the perfect ashlar represents the being of the Mason, the spiritual, psychological, and physical presence that he is striving to become. In short, the ashlar is the soul, the metaphysical presence within one's physical body, and without which the body cannot survive. In that last sense, the soul is also rightly regarded as the cornerstone of one's material and social being. Using the tree of life, we can trace the geometry of the individual soul thusly. Illustrating its metaphysical existence above the material world, the bottom sephirah, Malkut. Malkut is where the physical body is formed, lives, dies, and decays. There is a great deal to contemplate in this diagram of the individual soul and its relationship with the 10 fundamental principles of creation, much more than we can presently explore. For now, we note one particular detail, which is that the uppermost corner of the cube is in dot. Recall that dot means knowledge, as in Noesis, which can be attained through the Noesis of Plato. In its loftiest sense, dot is a reflection of the very first sephirah called Keter, or what Plato would call the form of the good. That lofty reflection exists in all of us, whether we are conscious of it or not. For we are, as Genesis says, all created in the image, or the form, of God. From a Platonic perspective, this is something we can come to remember. So the challenge for a Masonic mystic is to recall, to awaken to, the reality of that reflection, that image or form of God, being the point from which his own individual soul takes its form. To contemplatively turn our attention toward dot is thus necessary for achieving our greatest potentials in perfecting the ashlars of our souls and consecrating the cornerstones of our lives in this world. In many versions of the Knight Rose-Croix degree, the 6 faces of the cube are unfolded to reveal the dimensions of a Latin cross with a red rose at the center. Using symbolic geometry, note that the number of segments on the horizontal axis is 3, and that there are 4 on the vertical. We are also using a rose of 5 petals, which is common in the Rosicrucian movement, perhaps especially because the Lutheran rose has 5 petals, and Rosicrucianism arose from a context of Lutheran Christianity. It is very fitting symbolically because these 3 numbers, 3, 4, and 5, nicely plug into the Pythagorean theorem. The right triangle of sides with the lengths of 3, 4, and 5 is commonly used in Masonry to illustrate how the human soul, represented by the numeral 5, is the result of the divine triune, represented by the numeral 3, manifesting through the 4 elements of creation. And we can now see the parallel of meaning in the Rose-Croix. We may believe in this union of the human with the divine. We may have faith that it is true, but it is only through Noesis that we can actually know it. In fact, in some schools of Christian and Hermetic Kabbalah, the divine name associated with the central sephirah of beauty is Yud-He-Vav-He Aloha Vedat, roughly translated as God manifest in knowledge, which alludes to the conscious blooming of awareness, the Noesis, that one is a living reflection of the divine. The crux ansata, or Ankh, is another symbol provided in various versions of the Knight Rose-Croix degree, and there are a number of insights that can occur through its contemplation. For now, however, we focus on the fact that it has a repeating presence in the Rosicrucian movement and is shown in the image of a cruciform rose in this illustration from the text Summum Bonum, a Rosicrucian treatise under the name of Joachim Frisius, widely suspected to be a pseudonym for the 17th century scholar Robert Fludd. Fludd is also regarded as having been an influence on early speculative Freemasons. The Latin words dat rosa mel apibus mean the rose gives the bees honey. According to the analogy we have been following, this saying suggests that the flowering of mystical consciousness has powerful and pleasant effects, and not only for the one who directly experiences that flowering within the soul. The word apibus is plural, bees. In Masonry and outside of it, bees commonly symbolize workers. Masonically speaking, the term workers is used for all of us laboring in the betterment of our souls and the world around us. Thus, when someone learns to partake of the light that is dot, one is also then able to share it with others. And in fact, such other bees will naturally be drawn to such an awakened individual. But how does that attraction happen? In everyday life, what is it about such an individual that other aspirants find attractive? What is the pollen borne by the blossoming mystic that supports the other bees in making honey? A very clear geometrical clue to the answer is provided in this image. You probably already know this is the sign of the planet Venus, named for the Roman goddess of love. And while Venus is usually associated with the love of emotional affections and erotic attractions, in a more complete sense, she is the essence of all love, including brotherly love, the love of virtue, the love of truth, beauty, and goodness, and our mystical love for the divine. This is why Venus so frequently appears in the texts of Rosicrucianism and spiritual alchemy. In fact, hidden in various forms, she is a key figure in the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz from 1616, the third of the three original manifestos of the Rosicrucian movement. Of the three, that one is a highly symbolic and allegorical tale of mystical awakening and service to the divine. Getting more to the point, the chemical wedding teaches that love, purified, refined, and magnified by mystical realization, is the greatest good and the secret to transformation. Said another way, it is the pollen that the rose makes to attract bees, and it is also the honey the bees then make from that pollen. Now let us take one more step in seeing how the geometry of this symbol of all-encompassing love aligns with the tree of life. You might immediately recognize the circumpunct, the point within a circle, which represents the emanation of deity from its primordial point out into the whole sphere of creation. Note that it is also the sign of the sun and of gold. In this case, the sixth sephirah, called Tiferet in Hebrew, is shown as part of the circle of the six highest sephirot on the tree, and Dot is in the place of the central point. Both of these details allude to the awakened mystic's realization of oneness with the primordial divine point. Tiferet is also the meeting place of the circle with the cross of the five sephirot below. The whole diagram may then be regarded as an image of mystical awareness, Noesis, or Noesis, shining like the sun down into, through, and upon a human personality, an embodied soul represented by the pendant cross. Implicit within all of this is that the entirety of creation, represented by the tree of life, is an emanation of divine love, that the awakened mystic knows oneself as a child of that love and seeks to more fully harmonize with it and share that love with everyone, everywhere, all the time. And awakened mystic is a metaphorical rose, freely sharing the beauty of its appearance, its fragrance, and its pollen, by which the bees make the honey that is their own outpouring of love. All of this is most simply summarized in a central teaching of the Night Rose Croix degree, which is the new law of love, the commandment to love with the all-embracing, ever-present love of the Logos, the Word. Now let's be clear on the fact that this love isn't limited to the way we commonly think about love. In order to be divine, to be the love that is God and God's presence in us, as stated in 1 John 4, verse 16, then this divine love cannot merely be the feelings of attraction and affection that are opposed by feelings of repulsion and dislike. Nor is it simply a courageous and compassionate attitude that can be hindered by fear and selfishness. Likewise, love is not limited to caring ways of thinking and acting that can succumb to hatred or apathy. So, for the most mystical knowledge of and participation in love, you must be at least genuinely open to the possibility that divine love, and so the root of human love, is, like the point in geometry, both an ineffably transcendent mystery and an immediately present reality. We must, through the contemplative approach of Noesis, learn to open our consciousness to more than the visible realm, to the radiation of truth that is higher even than the rational process of dianoia. We may thus, through our own devotion and with the blessings of ineffable grace, come to knowledge of the essential archetype of love. And truly realize that we are always and everywhere experiencing and expressing divine love in temporary and limited yet abundantly wondrous forms. Thank you for joining me in a contemplation of the point, line, superficies, and solid in symbolism and philosophy. If you're interested in this contemplative approach to Freemasonry, then you're welcome to purchase any of my books at Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles, and other online booksellers. And you can also find more information about my work at my website, chuckdunning.com, at the Contemplative Builder YouTube channel. That's my personal channel. Also the Contemplative Builder Facebook page. And you're welcome to send email to me at contemplativebuilder@gmail.com. Once again, thank you.